Welcome to Bourbon and BS, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of whiskey spirits, one shot at a time. I'm Mike Fody, founder and director of the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company, where our goal is to help you master spirits and guide choices. Today we're uncorking the secrets behind the grains used to make whiskey. Whether you're a seasoned connoisseur or just starting your whiskey journey, understanding the grains used and their impact on flavor will enhance your appreciation of whiskey. We'll first review the main four grains typically used to make whiskey, followed by typical varieties of each grain and the impact that it will have on flavor and aroma. I'll also cover some rarely heard of grains and important terms as needed. So let's get started with this episode of Bourbon and BS, all about grains, but not required. For example, the Buffalo Distilling Company has a product called Whiskey Plank that uses a 7-grain mash bill, not very frequently heard of. There's also a distillery I visited in Weston, West Virginia called Man Cave that produces its bourbon using 100% corn and no other grain. That would be a 1-grain mash bill. The mash bill just consists of the base grain typically, which is a grain in the greatest quantity by weight. And for bourbon, the corn must be a minimum of 51% of the grain used. The flavoring grain is a grain in the next highest amount. And the third grain, typically malted barley, makes up only 5 to 10% of the total weight. So what you're seeing here is a 3-grain mash bill, which is extremely common in the whiskey industry. If the flavoring grain makes up 20% or more of the total, it's known as a high flavor grain. In other words, a high rye bourbon or a high wheat bourbon. Now that's not a formal TTB label or definition. That's just what has happened as far as naming goes over the years. And so here's an example. A mash bill of 69% corn, 25% wheat, and 6% malted barley would be a high wheat bourbon, provided it meets all the other requirements to be a bourbon. Strictly speaking, any whiskey made in the U.S. with 51 to 100% corn, if it meets the other requirements, is a bourbon. The 20% or more wheat makes it the high wheat bourbon, and the malted barley just provides the enzymes to break down starches into simple sugars, which yeast consume to produce ethanol or alcohol. Corn whiskey is its own beast, which I'm not going to cover today in today's podcast. But just for clarification, corn whiskey under TTB regulations is defined as whiskey distilled at no more than 160 proof from a fermented mash containing at least 80% corn. And unlike bourbon, it's aged in used or uncharred oak barrels rather than new charred oak barrels. This distinction makes corn whiskey unique among American whiskeys because it's emphasizing the high corn content and the flexible aging requirements or maturation requirements. The recipe versus the mash bill is the mash bill plus the yeast used to ferment the cooked grains to produce ethanol and other congeners. Yeast is covered in a separate episode, but just understand that the yeast does change the profile of the whiskey because different yeasts produce different congeners during the fermentation process. 4-grain mash bills are also common, which could include something like corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley. A 7-grain mash bill is a bit of a misnomer because typically, for instance, in the one that I've had called Whiskey Plank, there's 4 grains, but 3 are used malted and 3 are unmalted. So in other words, they use corn, and then they use rye, barley, wheat, and then they use malted rye, malted barley, and malted wheat. Now, rye, barley, and wheat do produce enough enzymes to cause conversion of starches into simple sugars. So now let's focus on the typical 4 grains used for whiskey production. These grains impart specific qualities to the final product. And remember, I said typically because everyone's senses are different, so each person's sensory experience is different. Those 4 grains, which I mentioned before, are corn, rye, wheat, and barley. So I'll cover them in that order. First, let's talk about corn. The aroma of corn is usually a husky aroma, grass notes with a touch of sweetness. On the palate, it's sweet and subtle flavors of vanilla and caramel. The mouthfeel is silky and smooth, and the finish ends with a slightly fruity note and a touch of oak. Of course, all of this is variable based on your sense and the way that the product is matured. Various corn types are commonly used in whiskey production. Some of the common forms of corn are yellow dent corn. It's often used as a base grain for whiskey, and it contributes to this mild, sweet flavor. It's characterized by its very high starch content and relatively neutral taste. Why would you want a lot of starch? Because the starch is converted into simple sugars, and that simple sugar is converted into ethanol. So you want as much starch as you can get, which means the other chemicals like nitrogen, you don't want a lot of those in your product because you're going to get a poor alcohol yield. The next corn is heirloom flint corn. It's also known as Reed Yellow Dent No. 2. It offers a more robust flavor profile with a nuttier, earthier taste and hints of toasted cornbread. Some distillers appreciate its unique character and use it to create distinctive whiskeys. Then there's Cherokee Dent, historically used for American whiskey and bourbon. Cherokee Dents have softer starch and slightly oilier kernels, resulting in a richer, more complex flavor. Whiskeys made with Cherokee Dent may exhibit deeper caramel, vanilla, and spicy notes. Next is feed corn. It's known for its protein content and higher oil content. Feed corn is sometimes used. It's an economical choice, but its flavor profile may not be as distinctive and not as preferable by a lot of producers. White corn, while less colorful, white corn can be a suitable option, contributing a milder taste to the whiskey. Flour corn, with its starchy kernels. Flour corn can add complexity to whiskeys. Then there's red corn, which is often used for tortillas. Red corn can yield interesting flavors in whiskey. Another corn that I've actually had experience with is black corn. It's Peruvian black corn, or also known as maize morado, often appearing deep purple to nearly black. It's an ancient Andean varietal grown at high altitudes, often above 10,000 feet. It's rich in anthocyanins, the same pigments found in blueberries and blackberries, which give it its striking color. Peruvian distillers, most notably Don Michael Distillery, use Andean black corn as a primary grain in their mash bill. Black whiskey uses about 60% Andean black corn in its mash bill. The corn contributes to a toasted corn, vanilla, dried fruit, cinnamon, cardamom, and caramel corn notes in its final spirit. I've had this product and I actually like it a lot. I found it to be very enjoyable. They also use mountain water for the proofing and a high altitude fermentation distillation process. Why does that all matter? Because black corn whiskey is highly aromatic. It's deeper, darker grain sweetness. Spice and dried fruits undertones occur, and it has a unique terroir signature due to the altitude, the climate, and the corn genetics that all influence the flavor. I want to mention some productions around corn mashing and nixtamalization, it's called. Why is it rare for distilleries to malt corn? Malted corn does exist, but it's extremely uncommon in commercial whiskey production, and the reasons are because it's not practical, chemically it's a pain in the ass, and economically it's not a good option for most producers. Corn whiskey has what's called very low diastatic power when malted. What's diastatic power? It's a measure of the enzymes that are produced, the amylases that convert starches to fermentable sugars. So if it doesn't produce a lot of enzymes or enough enzymes to make the conversion happen, you're not going to be producing enough alcohol to make it financially feasible. So malted corn cannot self-convert efficiently. It can't convert other grains efficiently. So you still need to add malted barley or added enzymes. Now, in the U.S., for whiskeys and other countries that allow you to add exogenous or external enzymes, that's not as much of a problem, although it will add to the cost. But for if you're in Scotland or the UK or the EU, you're not allowed to add exogenous enzymes, and so they would not be able to use malted corn by itself because it just doesn't convert enough starches into sugars. Malted corn is expensive and it's inefficient, as I mentioned. The kernels are larger, they're harder to break down, they're harder in consistency, so they're harder to mill. They're more moisture resistant, so they don't absorb water well, and they're more prone to mold during germination. This makes malting slower, riskier, labor intensive, and a lot more expensive. Why pay more for a grain that doesn't give you more? Corn already has plenty of starch without malting, so barley needs malting to unlock the starch, develop enzymes, and create precursors. Corn doesn't. Corn is already high in starch and easy to gelatinize. So that makes it easy to convert when you add exogenous or outside enzymes. So it doesn't have the problem, it creates one. The flavor benefits are subtle. Malted corn does taste different. It's sweeter, softer, and more honeyed. That's why a lot of distilleries, especially bourbon distilleries, they don't stick to that 51% for their bourbon mash bill. A lot of them are in the 60s and 70s because it gives that sweetness, the softer, more honeyed experience to the taste and to the smell. But it is subtle. It's often lost in barrel influence, and it's not dramatic enough to justify the cost. Craft distillers who use malted corn often do it for novelty, not efficiency. Interestingly enough, that Man Cave distillery that I talked about, they produce all their own corn. So for them, because the production costs are less, that's why they go ahead and produce their 100% corn bourbon. Industrial distilling is built around unmalted corn. The American whiskey infrastructure is optimized for raw corn, high temperature cooking, exogenous enzymes, and large-scale efficiency. Malting corn would require new equipment, new supply chains, new cost structures. So most distilleries simply don't see the return on investment for it. The exceptions prove the rule. A few distilleries do use malted corn, as I mentioned. Balkans in Texas, Blue Corn Malt Whiskey. Wood Hat Spirits in Missouri, they use heirloom corn malts. High Wire Distilling, Heritage Corn Experiments. And some craft maltsters like the one I had mentioned, the Man Cave, they also like it. I've had the Man Cave all corn whiskey, and I find it to be enjoyable, but I don't pay any more for it than I would for other bourbons or whiskeys. So just a one-sentence summary. Distilleries rarely malt corn because it's expensive, inefficient, low in enzymes, and offers only modest flavor benefits compared to simple raw corn with added enzymes. Now, I did mention the process of nixtamalization. Nixtamalization is a 4,000-year-old Mesoamerican process traditionally used to prepare corn for food. It involves soaking and cooking the corn in an alkaline solution, back in the day usually lime water, rinsing and removing the loosened husks, grinding and using the softened kernels. According to search results, nixtamalization softens a grain, increases nutritional value, improves flavor and aroma, and reduces mycotoxins, which are associated with mold. This process is normally used to make masa for tortillas, tamales, and pozole, but one distillery has adapted it for whiskey. How nixtamalization is used in whiskey production? The clearest example is the Abasolo ancestral corn whiskey from Mexico. Their production process explicitly uses nixtamalization to uncover the deepest flavors of ancestral corn. But again, as I mentioned, where does it fit? When does it happen? It happens before malting if it's used. It happens before milling. It happens before mashing, and then before fermentation. Why would distillers use it? It changes the corns in ways that matter for whiskey. They feel like it enhances flavor release, They indicate it unlocks deeper corn flavors, gives it a roasted corn, honey, vanilla, black tea, and leather. They also indicate it's more fermentable for the grain. It makes it softer, so it's easier to ferment it. It softens the kernels. It makes starches more accessible, improves grindability, increases available nutrients for yeast. Because nixtamalization reduces mycotoxins and removes the hull, the mash can ferment more cleanly and predictably. It's a distinctive corn identity. Nixtamalization corn expresses earthy sweetness, toasted grains, deeper aromatic complexity, and a flavor profile that's closer to mesa, roasted corn, and heirloom grain character. So that's why a business like Absolo Markets uses it. It makes it a unique product, and everybody's looking for a way to make their product unique and have it be separated from all the noise in the market. So again, to sum this up, why is corn malting or large quantities of corn not used? And the biggest issue is it's a moot point in most countries. It's only in Scotland and by extension the EU that prohibits the use of exogenous enzymes for starch conversion. Corn just doesn't provide a good product to make 100% whiskey out of, and it requires a lot of extra money, enzymes, etc. Let's move away from corn now and head towards rye, which a lot of people love. From an aroma perspective, rye provides spicy flavors of black and green pepper, anise, and mint. On the palate, it imparts a drier mouthfeel, sometimes described as leathery. And the finish, it enhances clove and nutmeg flavors from the barrel. Poorly distilled rye can induce methanol or camphor notes as well. American rye whiskey has to have a mash bill containing at least 51% rye, and it's known for its bold, spicy character. People expect aromas of cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper on the palate. It delivers a robust flavor with hints of caramel, dry fruit, and a peppery. Then there's Canadian rye whiskey. Despite its name, Canadian rye whiskey can be light and smooth, often featuring gentle notes of vanilla, honey, and toasted oak. The challenge with Canadian rye whiskey is that the Canadian government doesn't regulate the amount of rye that's in the whiskey. Some of them have no rye in it. So unless it states it on the label, you don't really know what you're drinking or what you're getting. But it can add subtle spiciness. Then there's Maryland style rye. It's comprising 65 to 70% rye and 30 to 35% corn. Maryland style rye leans towards sweetness because of the high amount of corn, and you'll find aromas of brown sugar, citrus, and baking spices. The taste profile includes a balance of sweet and spicy notes. Then there's Pennsylvania style rye. Now, Pennsylvania, of course, was the first area in the United States where whiskey was produced, and because rye would basically grow on a dry rock, it was used to produce whiskey in the early days of the settlement of the United States. Similar to Maryland style rye, it has a higher rye content, often intense spiciness with flavors like anise, mint, and dark chocolate. The finish can be pleasantly warming. I want to mention Empire Rye whiskey. Empire Rye isn't a federal legal category yet, but it's a tightly defined regional standard created by the Empire Rye Whiskey Association in New York State. What are the core requirements? The mash bill must contain at least 75% New York State grown rye grains. Mashing, fermentation, distillation, and aging must all occur at a single New York distillery. It can be distilled at no higher than 160 proof, barreled at 115 proof or lower, stricter than the federal standard of 125, aged for a minimum of 2 years in new charred American oak barrels, and all rye must be grown anywhere within New York State. The varietal that's used is up to the distiller as long as the rye was grown in New York State. What's not regulated? The barrel size, the rye varietal, the yeast strain that's used. You could use malted rye as well, the still type, and the aging warehouse. This gives the New York State distillers a lot of freedom to while they're making their products, so it can be very different from other ones that are produced. Again, its legal designation is not codified in New York State by law, but the association is actively trying to formalize it both federally and in New York State. So let's move on to wheat. Wheat is less common, but contributes a soft, mellow touch. It's ubiquitous in baked goods, breads, bagels, biscuits, etc. Not typically the dominant grain in whiskey. Wheat whiskey varieties, there's a lot of them. I actually do like wheat whiskey. I find it to be a softer form of whiskey, and a lot of the time soft winter wheat is used for the production of wheat whiskey. But the flavors and aromas, there's a softness in the mouthfeel. It provides a smoother, more delicate profile. It's earthy and grassy. Wheat whiskey has a pleasant grassy, grainy note and an outdoorsy aroma. Minerally and slightly sweet when sipped, wheat can be simultaneously earthly and give you a minerally aroma and taste, but it's subtly sweet. Again, like any whiskey, for it to be whiskey, the grain, the wheat, has to be at least 51% in the mash bill, or it's not wheat whiskey. I've had a couple of wheat whiskeys. Bernheim, of course, makes one, and there's a company that makes one called William Whipple that I enjoy as well. So what kind of wheats do they use? One is soft red winter wheat. This wheat variety contributes a soft, sweet character to the whiskey. It often imparts notes of honey, caramel, vanilla, which you would also get off of the white oak barrels. In bourbon, it can create a smoother mouthfeel. Then there's hard red winter wheat, which is used in whiskey production and adds a robust flavor. You get nutty hints of nuttiness, baking spices. It can be earthy, but usually slightly earthy. Then it can enhance the overall complexity of the spirit. Soft white wheat. Although less common, soft white wheat can bring delicate floral and fruity notes to whiskey. Think of light citrus, orchard fruits, and a subtle creaminess. Then there's hard white wheat. This wheat variety is occasionally used in small quantities. It tends to be milder than other types, so it's hard to pick out, but it contributes to a gentle sweetness and a touch of cereal grain character. And then durum wheat. It's rarely used in whiskey making. Durum wheat can introduce unique flavors. It may offer nutty, biscuity, or even spicy notes depending on the distillation process. But also it can be more floury, and it can sort of plug up your filters and stuff, so a lot of places don't use it. So last but not least is barley. Of the four major grains, barley is typically used in the lowest amount by weight in American whiskey, not necessarily in the UK, because Scotland and Ireland use a significant amount of malted barley in their products, and Irish pot still whiskey uses about half malted and half unmalted barley. But remember, malted barley is used both for its aromatic profile as well as its diataste profile. And diataste, remember, is its ability to convert starches and complex carbohydrates into simple fermentable sugars. So again, the two forms of barley that are used are malted barley, which can be associated with a nutty, smoky, and sometimes chocolate or cocoa flavors and aromas. It has a characteristic maltiness to it, and it's described as cereal or toast-like. I pick up that maltiness every time I drink a single malt Scotch whiskey, and I find it actually very enjoyable. Now, unmalted barley is slightly different. It's got more cereal qualities to it. It introduces a light, sharp, and sour fruity notes like green apple and lemon. And again, Irish whiskey commonly employs unmalted barley because the government started taxing whiskey based on the percentage of malted barley used to produce the whiskey. So isn't it funny how everybody's always looking for a way to escape the taxes, and the government's always trying to find ways to add new taxes when we do that. Some of the varieties of barley that are used are Belgravia, often used in malt whiskey. It adds a richness and a depth. You can expect honeyed sweetness and a touch of nuttiness. Concerto barley, it's widely favored for its high yield. It imparts complexity with notes of caramel and toasted grains. Propino barley, it's known for its malting quality. So in other words, it produces a high amount of enzymes to convert as much of those carbohydrates and starches into simple fermentable sugars. And that adds a sweetness and a subtle spiciness. There's quench barley. That has balanced attributes. It enhances both the overall taste, and it also gives hints of vanilla and cereal to it. And finally, shuffle barley. It's a new variety appreciated for its unique character. Some think it has a gentle spiciness and a toastiness associated with it. So again, malted grains bring a sweeter, rounded, and more expressive character to whiskey because the malting process develops enzymes and releases sugars that create flavors like honey, biscuit, toffee, and fruit. Unmalted barley, by contrast, tends to produce drier, more grain-forward profile with sharper edges. Think earthy, grassy, cereal-driven notes with less inherent sweetness and very little fruitiness at all. When both are used together, the malted portion adds depth and fermentable richness, while the unmalted portion contributes structure and spice. And some of the products that you might think about, particularly with Irish whiskey, Irish pot still whiskey is like a red breast, or I believe green spot. One of the spots, either green spot or yellow spot, has both of them in it. And those two added together sort of balance each other out and make it a more complex and interesting product. So while we're on the topic of conversion to fermentable sugars, it's really a three-step process. The first is modification, the second is gelatinization, and the final is enzymatic hydrolysis. The processes are part of mashing and cooking process in brewing and distilling. The conditions in the mash tun or the cooking vat vary depending upon the specific setup, the products being produced, and the requirements of the end product. It's important to optimize the conditions based on the final product that the distiller wants from the grains that were chosen. So the appropriate temperatures, you have to have just the right environment to maximize enzymatic activity. Enzymatic hydrolysis is a two-step process involving typically alpha amylase and beta amylase, and to a lesser degree glucoamylase. So the first part is called liquefaction. Then during the first step, alpha amylase breaks down the long-chain water-soluble starches or carbohydrates into shorter chain sugars known as dextrins. During saccharification, which is the second step, beta amylase and to a lesser degree glucoamylase further break down these short chain dextrins into simple sugar molecules, typically glucose, could be fructose, that are fermentable by the enzymes, or by the yeast, I'm sorry. Important about enzymes. Enzymes are catalysts. They help the conversion of simple starch to sugar, but they're not used up during the process. Thus, you don't need a lot of enzymes in order to make that conversion to simple sugars. That's something that sometimes people have trouble understanding, because if it's only like 6% by weight of the total mash bill, how could that convert all those starches? Well, the reason is because the enzymes don't get used up. They just do the conversion and move on to the next dextrin molecule. But they do have narrow therapeutic windows. Therapeutic windows, not really the right term, but narrow therapeutic temperatures and pH ranges, which require certain other chemicals to work properly. Alpha amylase, this enzyme cleaves the glucose linkages of starch at random points to produce larger fragments, which I already mentioned are called dextrins. but the optimal pH is 6.7 to 7.0. If it's above or below that, they'll still function, but they won't give you the kind of conversion you're looking for to maximize alcohol production. Beta amylase similarly breaks the dextrins into two glucose units, which are really the fermentable form of the starch molecule, and it results in maltose or in glucose. And the optimum pH for beta amylase is between 4 and 5. And then finally, glucoamylase does the same thing with a pH range of 5.4 to 6.2. So you can see that there's a challenge for the fermentation process because you have to find the optimal conditions for all three enzymes to work. And those conditions include the pH, which I mentioned. So the best pH for all three is around 6.7 to 7. The optimal temperature range is 63 to 68 degrees centigrade for brewing and for whiskey production. And then you also have to have a decent concentration of certain minerals like calcium ions, which are metalloenzymes that are involved in this whole enzymatic process. So enough about enzymes and what they do and how they do it. Let's move on to other grains used in whiskey production. These are beyond the big four: corn, rye, wheat, and barley. And I've had some of these products. I've had products that were made partially with the big four and then with a little bit of, say, oat or millet or some of these other things, but I can't say that I've tried them all. The first one that I'll talk about are oats, and because I've never had oat whiskey, people say it's creamier, silkier, nuttier. It adds a soft sweetness. Some of the oats that are the brands that use oats are Covell Oat Whiskey out of Chicago, High West Silver Oat, and Corsair also makes a product called Oat Rage. Oats were widely used in Scotland up until the 18th century and in Ireland into the 20th century. Some distillers still use it, but as a hook to get people to try things. Some people say that the oat gives it sort of a porridgey kind of a experience to it. Millet's the next one, and people say millet gives a earthy, grassy, light honey, subtle spiciness. Covell Millet Whiskey is an example. New Southern Revival Millet Whiskey from Highwire Distilling is another one. And again, they say it gives a nuttiness, and it's an alternative to grain. Corsair Distillery in Nashville has used it. I've never had millet whiskey. Sorghum is another product that gives sort of a molasses-like, earthy, rustic sweetness to it. Corsair makes a sorghum whiskey. Queen Jeannie sorghum whiskey is made out of the Old Sugar Distillery. Buckwheat, technically a seed, not a grain, but buckwheat whiskey I have had, and it came in a little 375 ml bottle, and people say that it gives it a toasted grain, cocoa, roasted nut, earthy type of a flavor and aroma. Quite frankly, Corsair does a lot of these experimentations, so they make a buckwheat whiskey, and the Distillerie des Mines Edu in France also makes a buckwheat whiskey, which is the one that I've had. But quite honestly, I don't really care for it. The whiskey was not clear. It was very cloudy looking, and the texture was sort of grainy. It didn't appeal to me at all, and quite frankly, I gave it to a bunch of different people, and nobody really cared for it. But again, that's all a personal thing. Rice is another grain. It's delicate, floral, soft, clean, lightly sweet. Of course, you know that rice is used to make sake. Some of the rice whiskeys, most of them are coming out of Japan that I know of. Oishai rice whiskey, Fukano rice whiskey, and Hakata whiskey. All of them use rice. I don't know to what degree, but it doesn't really appeal to me. I've seen them in some local retail shops, and I should pick up a bottle or two just to see what it's like, but I never have. I like to use my money on stuff that I know I like. And I wouldn't mind doing it if they had a tasting and I could taste to see if I liked it. If I knew I liked it, then I would spend the money. Another grain is quinoa, and I've never had a quinoa whiskey. It's said to give a grassy, nutty, herbal, slightly bitter flavor and aroma. Corsair makes a quinoa whiskey. As far as I know, Corsair is the only distillery that's looking at that grain, and people say it adds an earthy and nutty flavor to the whiskey. Another one is Svelte. It's been said that it gives bready, malty, rustic, slightly sweet profile. Efal Whiskey in Germany produces it. Loch Lomond has experimented with Spelt in limited run. And this is a low gluten grain and has found that it's firmer and more nuttier in character than millet. The next one is Emir or Einkorn. These products are heritage wheats. They give a bready, crusty kind of a profile, honey, toasted grain. Highwire Distilling produces one called Jimmy Red, which is a combination of corn and emmer, and various European craft distillers use it in some of their products. And finally, the last one that I'm going to talk about is Triticale. It's a cross between rye and wheat, and it's sometimes used in Canada. The flavor is, perhaps not surprisingly, halfway between the two. So again, finally, just keep in mind that all the major grains can be used as a malted form or an unmalted form, and depending on which form you're using, it's going to drive different aromas and flavors. The enzymes activate and convert starch to sugar, and it creates a Maillard-driven flavored compounds, which is more the caramels, the darker compounds. Sometimes if it goes a little bit too far, it can actually give a smoky or a burnt aroma and flavor to the product. And as I said, you can have malted barley and unmalted barley, malted rye, malted wheat, and unmalted wheat. So in conclusion, the producer must decide which grains to use and in what percentages in their mash bill. Next, they decide how to mill them. And why is that important? Is because if you mill it too small, it turns it into flour, and that doesn't process properly. If you don't mill it small enough, the grains are still very large, and there's a lot of starches, carbohydrates that are not exposed to be converted into fermentable sugars, which then would result in a low yield of alcohol from your production process. Then the next thing it also requires is the right enzymes, whether you're using exogenous ones or endogenous ones, the right nutrients, minerals, the correct temperatures and pH. All of these factors play a huge role in how much fermentable sugar and ultimately ethanol is available to distill into your new make spirit or white dog in order to then mature it and obtain the whiskey that you're looking for, whether it's bourbon or Scotch or Irish whiskey. So thanks for joining me on this whiskey deep dive. Next time you get a chance to do a tasting activity, try using a sheet that I have produced on my blog or another sheet. So you start developing this consistent assessment process. And I swear, once I started doing that, it really helped me start discovering these different aromas and textures and flavors, as well as how to express what I was experiencing and sharing that with somebody else. That's when it really becomes a lot of fun, because everybody does have a different experience. And so whether as a beginner discovering new flavors or as an aficionado pursuing perfection, the journey always has another fascinating glass to offer. Join me at the Buffalo Distilling Company for a deluxe tour, or by signing up on my website for a whiskey workshop in the near future. I appreciate you listening. Until the next podcast, keep sipping, keep exploring, and remember, good whiskey is a well-crafted story. A special shout out to the Buffalo Distilling Company for use of their distillery for my tours, tastings, and the new whiskey workshop. Again, please leave questions or comments on my website at bisonbourbonspiritstc.com. And this podcast provides general information and entertainment. Always drink responsibly and consult local regulations before imbibing. This podcast is meant for listeners who are of legal drinking age wherever they live. I'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, Check out the blog, explore my merchandise, and join me for a workshop or a deluxe tasting. Cheers to bold spirits and curious minds.